So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Fuller from the Southport Historical Society, and this is both a second Tuesday talk and a special edition of Southport's Armchair History. So, as always, we're grateful to the Southport Library and the Friends of the Library in Southport and Oak Island for their help in getting the word out about our programs. Now, some of you who called in may have been expecting a different talk on the Battleship North Carolina. And I apologize for the change. That talk is still going to be held. It's going to be held in June. And our plan right now is to have it in person at the Harper Library. And we're also going to try to broadcast it out on Zoom. So you won't have to miss out. You just have to wait a little bit for that program. So instead, I'm going to present another in my series of Southport in Love and War. And we're going to talk about a romance that took place in Southport under the shadow of World War II. Oops. Okay, so this story reminds me a little of those childhood fairy tales where a princess kisses a frog and he turns into a handsome prince. And this story is a little bit like that, except instead of a princess, there is a beautiful Southern belle. And instead of a frog, there is a frogman. And luckily, he does turn out to be a prince among men, as we're soon going to find out. So if you've attended talks that I've given on World War I, you'll recall that during that war, Southport created an Army-Navy club at the Masonic Lodge. It was a collaborative effort between the Masons and the Red Cross under the supervision of the War Camp Community Service. It was pretty leading edge at the time, and it really underscored to the government the importance of having facilities like this for the men in uniform. So in 1941, after the US instituted the first peacetime draft, President Roosevelt requested that a focus be put on providing morale and recreation services to US uniformed military personnel by the entire public, not just specific communities like the Southport one had put a burden on Southport and Wilmington. This was across the country. So this request, sorry, I'm going to turn the page. This request brought together 6 civilian organizations. So if you look on this poster from left to right, it was the National Jewish Welfare Board, the National Catholic Community Service, the YMCA, the YWCA, the Salvation Army, and the National Travelers Aid Association. They were brought together under one umbrella called the USO, or United Service Organization, and their goal was to support US troops. So that's why when you see the USO flag or their logo, they have 6 stars on them. They symbolize those 6 organizations that support the USO. So Roosevelt said he wanted these private organizations to handle the on-leave recreation of the men in the armed forces. So the government built the buildings, and the USO raised private funds to carry out its main mission, which was to boost the morale of the military. So the USO began raising money across the entire company to support their programs. Between their start in 1941 and the end of World War II in 1945, they raised approximately $33 million, which seems like a huge amount, but then when you think about inflation, that would be the equivalent of $433 million today. There were 7 government-built USOs in southeastern North Carolina, and the first permanent USO in the entire country was built in Fayetteville to serve Fort Bragg, and it was completed in November of 1941. But Southport wasn't far behind. Construction of Southport's USO hut began in October of 1941 and was completed in just 6 weeks. It finished 11 days ahead of schedule. It was built on federal land, and it cost $22,000, which was just under $500,000 today's dollars. It was adjacent to Fort Johnston, basically where the Southport Community Center is today. The building was completed on Friday, December 5th. So I think we all know what happened on Sunday, December 7th. 2 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So 2 days after they finished the USO, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And by the end of that week, the US was at war with both Japan and Germany, and of course, Italy. So as I said, the community center is in that location today, not the original USO. The original USO building burned down in the 1990s, and it was a sad day for Southport because many people had a lot of good memories of their time in that building, because after it was the USO, after the war ended, then it became Southport's community building. But I do have to say, the men who originally built it might have been surprised to learn that it had lasted 50 years. They really saw it as a temporary military structure that was meant to serve an urgent purpose, not necessarily a long-lasting building like that. So in many ways, it was a real accomplishment that it had lasted as long as it did. This picture, in case it's a little confusing, the building to the right is Fort Johnston, the garrison that you think of as a brick building today. That was Fort Johnston. And then and this is behind it, you know, back where the public restrooms are, closer to the Maritime Museum. And then on the left, that's the USO building, sitting where the community building is today. So just like with the Army Navy Club that was at the Masonic Lodge that preceded it, the USO gave the military men a wholesome place to go when they were off duty. And it became the center of a lot of activity in Southport. Women and girls signed up to be hostesses to help visit with the men who were off duty. There was ping pong and other recreational activities and a canteen where they could get inexpensive meals. The USO gave the men a place they could go when they were on leave that would keep them out of trouble, because neither the military nor the town wanted them going to bars, loitering on the streets, or getting involved with the wrong kind of women. Here we go. Instead, they could go to the USO and have something to eat and listen to records, write letters home, see movies, attend dances, play cards or ping pong or other similar activities. Once a week, there were even home-cooked meals provided by the ladies of Southport. But of course, for the men, the biggest appeal were the junior hostesses who volunteered there. The junior hostesses were chaperoned by the senior hostess who worked there. They were young girls, 16 and older, who volunteered to provide support to the servicemen. They had to be wholesome girls with good reputations. They had to agree to follow rules like no smoking and no wearing slacks. And their role was to serve refreshments, to dance, to play games, and to socialize with the men. And even though it was against the rules, sometimes romance blossomed at the USO, and such was the case with today's lovebirds. So, George Gregory Jr. He was a 20-year-old sailor from Pennsylvania who was stationed at Caswell Naval Station Base. And Joy Arnold was a 16-year-old girl born and raised along the yacht basin in Southport. So in a minute, I'm going to let Joy tell you her story herself. I have a clip from an oral history interview I did with Joy about 3 years ago when she was in her early 90s. She told me about meeting her husband and a little about what he was like. So the sound quality is not great on this. We don't have great equipment at the Historical Society. We have a little bit better now, but we were doing this on a cell phone. But I went through and I typed in subtitles so you could better understand the conversation, even if you can't quite hear it. So turn your volume up, and Charlie, let me know if the sound doesn't come through or if you can't see the subtitle. And this video is about 10 minutes long. Let me see here.
But I'll tell you what, when World War II comes, my husband came, he was on the USS Ruby. Okay. And that ship come in, you know, it had to come in between Caswell and Bullhead Island. Okay. And he said, I hope I don't never have to come into here, you know. But it wasn't, but a few weeks later, he was stationed over on Caswell.
Oh, okay.
You know.
So and, that's where when you met him?
Well, I was hostess.
You were hostess?
At the USO.
Okay, at the Army Navy USO. Is that where the base of the Masonic Lodge?
That was the first No, that wasn't the Masonic.
Oh, okay. What was it?
This was the USO, and I was hostess, and the boys coming in off of the ships and all were stationed there, Castle City.
So, so now where was the USO?
Right down Southport on the waterfront where the old Johnson.
Where Fort Johnson?
Yeah.
Johnson is?
Yeah.
At the community center?
Yeah, it's a museum now.
Yes.
That was the USO.
Oh, that was the USO. Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
And
And you were still living at the yacht basin?
yeah, my mother owned 3 homes. Castle become a Navy base. Well, I was playing ping pong with one of the boys, and that's where I met my husband, George Gregory. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he sat there and was watching me play ping pong and stuff, and he said he fell in love with my toes. They were so cute. And so anyway, that night I was walking home in Southport. You didn't have to be afraid. I felt somebody following me. Oh. And I stopped and turned around, and there was Gregory. His name was George, but all the Navy boys and all at that time called everybody by their last names. And I stopped and I said, "What are you doing? Following me?" And he said, "Well, I like you." And I said, "Well, he wanted to walk home with me." I said, "Well, if you want to walk home with me, get up here beside me." So that's how I met my husband.
My goodness. Now, how old were you then? Do you remember?
Oh, I wasn't about 16, because I was married at 17.
You were married at 17. Oh my goodness.
So I met him. But the Castle, they had a Navy base, and I was liking a boy called Hippie.
Hippie?
H-I-P-K-E. He was from Bay City, Michigan. But I probably would have married him if my George hadn't appeared on the scene. You know?
That. So now, during the war, then did your husband go overseas after you got married?
Yeah, after we got married, honey, he volunteered for hazard duty, and he went to in training at Hutchinson Island down in Fort Pierce, Florida, and they had 2 islands, and they practiced blowouts, you know, because the Frogman, they had, is that thing up there where the boat is?
Yeah, I'll get it. You tell her.
They had a team of 5, and they had a ship that would pull the team so far offshore, and these, like my husband, would row in a boat and go in under dark, you know. And he was in Okinawa and Iwo Jima.
Wow.
But, you know, when he got out, he'd been in water so much he had his head full of fungus, and he lost his hearing. And he always had a hard time
hearing.
Right.
Were you worried a lot during the war that something would happen to him, or did you just think he was going to come home?
I knew he was going to come home. I just had that feeling, and I talked to the Lord. I said, "Bring that back to me." There's that thing, my husband, UDT 13.
The Frogman to the USS Bar on the UDT 13, and a Frogman would be the equivalent of a Navy SEAL nowadays.
That was a beginning of it. Yeah, I wanted to give that to the museum.
Yeah.
they wanted it.
Yes.
And I've got a tugboat, the Army. My husband worked at Sunny Point till he retired. And a friend of mine, Gaskell, his name was Gaskell. He was what we call a down homer. He made me a tugboat. Just
What's
like
a down home?
down home, Head City.
Oh, okay.
People we call them down homeless because they had a different talk, a different speech, you know. And he was one of our best friends.
So what did your husband think of you being you were a deputy and you had a bar and you had two other things?
A dress shop.
Dress shop.
A trailer park.
And a trailer park. What did your husband think about you having all those
My
businesses
husband
and
was
working?
the sweetest. There's three kinds of Yankees. I'm going to tell them to you.
Okay.
One of the Yankees doesn't like me.
Right, because he was a Yankee. He's from Pennsylvania.
He was a Yankee from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And anyway, his daddy come from the old country, grandpa. And then I had his mother's parents. One of them was from the old country, the Bohemians.
Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, the good Yankee, he comes down on vacations and looks all around and, oh, everything's just great. So he turns around and goes back where he come from. So then there's a little Yankee. That's the damn Yankee. He comes down here and he looks all around and he loves everything. And he in here no time before he's wanting to change everything. But we didn't do it like we did at home. And so, but I married the third one. You know what the third Yankee was? Galvanized Yankee. They're the ones that come down here and marry a beautiful Southern belle.
Oh.
And they lay back, you know, and don't try to change nothing. They make friends, they love everybody. So
you married a good one. A galvanized one.
Without a doubt, he's one. And I would go back to where he was from once a year, and I learned to cook like his mother. And that's how come he loved me better all the time. I fixed him nut rolls, poppy seed rolls, had those stuffed chickens with raisins and rice. I tell you what, she taught me a lot of stuff.
Wow.
And I love going.
I bet she liked you too then. You wanted to learn
Yeah,
how to
she
cook like her.
did. And her husband was Greek from overseas. I called him Grandpa. I love that man. He tried to teach me Greek. And the only thing I can remember was coffee. And he called it Kana Cafe. And he would keep things out and try to teach me Greek. But I couldn't pronounce all right things. So I tried to make him happy, but I never could remember nothing.
Okay, I hope you guys were able to hear all that, or at least read it. And I think there was a comment. I can't see chat, but Charlie, can you see the chat and tell me what that says? Is there a comment or question?
I don't see a chat. Yeah, there's one. Someone from Candace, there, everyone. Haha, galvanized Yankee. I've not heard that before.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Joy had some good theories. So, yeah, we all have to ask ourselves what kind we are. Okay. So, as Joyce said, she and her husband were married when she was just 17. Now, if you saw the previous Southport Love and War that I did, I told you about the fancy wedding and the multiple showers that Lois Jane Bustles and Davis Herring had. That they built the Lois Jane's bed and breakfast if you've been down there. But Joy's wedding was much less elaborate. If she did have showers, they didn't make it to the Southport Society pages. Her wedding was written up in the newspaper, and it was described as being very pretty. Joy and George were married on September 7th, 1943 at Southport Baptist Church, which is, you can see here the way it looked in the 1940s, which is very different than it looks today. This ceremony was performed by Reverend A.L. Brown. Some of you might recognize him as the father of Myrtle and Lulu Brown, and I will be talking about Myrtle and her husband in a subsequent one of these series. The wedding was performed following the Sunday church service. So it was a small affair. They had church and then they had the wedding. They didn't have any bridesmaids or groomsmen. Rachel Corlett, who you see here, sang at Joy's wedding. She sang The Sweetest Story Ever Told, and Mrs. D.I. Watson played the piano. Joy didn't wear a traditional wedding gown, maybe because they were having the ceremony right after the service and she didn't want to sit through the service in a wedding gown. She wore a brown wool suit with a corsage of red sweetheart roses. This is not the actual suit, but I kind of envision it looking like this. The paper said the church was nicely decorated. Both of their families were present. George's family had traveled all the way from Pennsylvania to attend. And as you can see, Joy had very good relationships with her in-laws. Afterward, they left for a 10-day wedding trip to Philadelphia. It was their honeymoon, but it was also George's chance to say goodbye to his family before he shipped overseas. So even though it was a small, simple ceremony, as you could tell from Joy's stories, the love between Joy and George ran very deep. Now, not long after the wedding, George was reassigned. So you remember Joy said her husband was a frogman. It's not a term we hear today. Frogmen were actually the precursors to the Navy SEALs. And the role was actually invented during World War II due to the need for amphibious invasions on beaches. So the men who participated were all volunteers. It was a hazardous duty at the front lines of battle, and they dealt with dangerous explosives. The men, for this extra risk, were paid $50 a month extra for their hazardous duty. And that doesn't sound like very much. And even if you convert it to today's dollars, it still doesn't sound like very much. It would be the equivalent of $800 a month. This is George, then it's circled in red. That is George with his underwater demolition team number 13. So each team had their own mascot, and the UDT 13s was a black cat. So I kind of get a kick out of that because, as you know, 13 is supposed to be an unlucky number and black cats are supposed to be unlucky. So instead of avoiding all of that, they just embraced that bad luck and called themselves the Black Cats. So as Joy mentioned, George was sent to Fort Pierce, Florida for training. And that was where all the underwater demolition teams trained. While he was there, he went through a very physically demanding training program, including a grueling final week referred to as Hell Week. And that culminated in the final day in which they were sent into the swamps and tropical conditions with bombs being set off all around them. They also had to pass a demanding physical test that required them to swim a mile without stopping. Now, the reason they needed to be able to swim a mile is that the Navy couldn't guarantee that they could get them closer to shore than that. They could get them within a mile, but they couldn't guarantee they could get them any closer. So they might have to drop them a mile away. So you might think, well, okay, if they have to drop them a mile away, shouldn't the test require that they be able to swim 2 miles so they could swim to their destination and then swim back? But the Navy reasoned if they could swim to shore to fulfill their mission, that with the enemy breathing down their necks, that they'd find the motivation to swim that mile back out to sea to get picked up. And so the test just required a mile to pass. So nearly half of the men washed out during training, but not George. He survived the training and became part of the elite underwater demolition team 13. The fact that he had made it into the underwater demolition team says a lot about George. He must have been a very competent, very brave, and very physically fit young man. So these demolitioners were often called frogmen. They had other nicknames as well. They were sometimes referred to as warriors in swim trunks or even the naked warriors. So they didn't literally go into battle naked, but it's likely that they felt pretty exposed because here you see them in their combat uniforms. In addition to their swim trunks, they had swim fins like these, a face mask like this one. Their only weapon was a sheath knife, like the one you see here. They coated themselves with cocoa butter and grease to try and protect themselves from the cold. They preferred silver or white grease because it provided better camouflage. So this grease looks pretty dark, but it may be because they've just come back from a mission and they're dirty, or it may be because the grease is used, or maybe they couldn't get the white grease that they liked. They carried a special slate with them that you see here. They wore that around their necks when they swam. They could write on that slate with a grease pencil and make notations while they were in the water. They also had the first dive watches so that they could rendezvous at the appropriate times. We forget that, you know, watches didn't always have the same time on them. You can see that this watch has a winder on the side and radium handles so that it would glow. They were also, these watches were also able to keep ticking even though they got wet and went underwater. And so before each mission, the men would synchronize their watches to make sure that they would all get back to the pickup location at the right time. So we're used to seeing pictures like this that show Allied military making an attack on the beach. But what we don't stop and think about is the work that has to be done before that attack can successfully take place. The military can't just pull up to a beach and let a bunch of men out. They need to know what they're getting into before they plan the attack, and they need to stack the deck in their favor. So even though beach landings seem quite straightforward, they require good advanced intelligence. Landing forces are most vulnerable when they are approaching the beach, like these men are here. Enemy mines, underwater obstacles can cripple their attacks. The obstacles have to be mapped out and removed if possible prior to the landing in order to avoid a disaster. So the Navy learned this lesson the hard way. This painting illustrates the landing at Tarawa. Much to their surprise, when they arrived at the landing site, the Americans first had to fight past a reef, then beach obstacles, and also mines, all under unexpectedly intense machine gun fire before they could unload the troops. The water turned out to be much deeper than they had expected, and the men had to slowly wade ashore, which made them easy targets for enemy fire. And the reason for this debacle was that the military had relied on aerial images for intelligence. No one had gotten eyes directly on the situation before the fight. So the result was that over 1,000 Marines died and another 2,000 were wounded. And after the military analyzed this, they thought that better information and more informed planning would have reduced that number. And so based on this tragic experience, the underwater demolition teams were born. Underwater demolition teams would arrive at a proposed battle location several days ahead of the main attack. The men prepared themselves for their missions aboard the main naval vessel, like you see here. They coated themselves with grease for camouflage and warmth. Each man partnered with a buddy. The military had discovered they had a much higher recovery rate if men buddied up and watched out for each other rather than going solo. And you see that tradition continued in scuba diving today. People always, the recommendation is always to go with a buddy. They were then lowered into a smaller speedboat, and they carried an inflatable raft with them. The speedboat would bring them to a pre-designated launch site, and it would also come back and pick them up at a designated time. So you can see in this boat, they've got an inflated raft laid across the boat, and I've got a close-up, but the close-up is pretty blurry. There's men sitting on the raft to keep it from flying away, to hold it in place. So the raft would then be attached to the side of the speedboat. One by one, the men would roll from the boat onto the raft. The speedboat would be traveling between 16 and 30 knots, between 18 and 34 miles per hour. When the man on the boat gave them a signal, they would roll off the inflatable boat and drop into the water. Then the next man would roll into position. And this way they could quickly drop the men at intervals stretched all along the drop-off line without slowing them down and making themselves a target. So the boat did not want to slow down to let men climb out of the boat and jump into the water. It had to be done quick, 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 like that. Okay, so here you see the line of men in the water. And then once in the water, the men had different missions. Their initial role was to serve as scouts. They would each swim in parallel lines from where they were dropped into shore. They would mark on the slates that they carried the depth of the water and any obstacles that they saw. The obstacles could be natural ones like coral reefs, or artificial ones like landmines or debris that had been purposely set up to obstruct landing. They would also get samples of the sand and the soil from the beach so that a judgment could be made as to whether the sand was strong enough to support the amphibious equipment that they wanted to land there. And then once they were back on the ship, all those individual pieces of information that the men had gathered was combined together to make a complete map of the whole area. So they each had one little piece, and then they would get back together and turn it into one big map. So this is a close-up of a certain kind of obstacle that they could have put out there to make it hard for a landing to take place. If they encountered obstacles, potentially like this one, they would then go back and blow them up. So they would use munitions and primacord. So the diver on the right is holding a bag of munitions that he's going to use to set up an explosion. And the diver on the left is wrapping primacord around an obstacle and setting up an explosive device. Now notice, these men are not wearing scuba tanks. They are doing all of this maneuvering while just holding their breath. The primacord served as a fuse that could be ignited underwater. The length of the cord gave the men a few minutes to swim far enough to be out of harm's way before the explosion took place. So you start to see how they were earning that extra $50 a month. Okay, so the men on the, when their mission was complete, the men would swim back to their pre-designated pickup spot. The boat would once be coming along at high speed. It didn't want to slow down and let people climb into the boat because they were all at risk for enemy fire. So what happened is the divers would reach their arms up in the air to indicate their position. And the men on the boat had a big rubber ring. And they would snag the men's arms in the ring and yank them back into the boat without slowing down. So they would just stick their arm in and they would pull them aboard, and then they would go for the next one, stick their arm in, pull them aboard, yank them in. Okay, so this picture is not actually one of the rings. I couldn't find a good picture of one of the rings, but from looking at it, this is actually a dog toy. But to me, the rings looked kind of like a great big one of these. And the men on the boat would hold on to one end, and the diver would stick his arm in the other one, and then they would just yank him into the boat at high speed. And I don't know how they didn't all end up with dislocated shoulders. If they missed or they weren't in the right position, the boat would have to go back around and try again. Or worst case, they would have to slow down to pick them up. Maybe they were injured and they couldn't grab onto the ring. The men on the boat, the men in the water, they were constantly in line of enemy fire, and slowing down or having to go back just put everyone at risk. So this, the first battle that UDT 13, George's team was involved in, was at Iwo Jima. Remember, Joyce said her husband was at Iwo Jima. This is the map that the military had to start with, but they needed additional information before the attack. So George's team was assigned the green beach, where you see that star, right next to Mount Suribachi, an inactive volcano. So that's where his team was to go make their landing. So here's a picture of that from the water. That's Mount Suribachi and Green Beach next to it. So 2 days before the attack, the UDT teams arrived. They were to gather information on the beach. So for this mission, the Frogmen, including George, they would be dropped about 700 yards offshore. Then they swam the rest of the way in. They had 1 hour to complete their mission and get back to the pickup spot. They coated their faces, shoulders, and arms with gray-blue paint as camouflage, and then cocoa butter or heavy grease to ward off the chilly 59-degree water temperature. They traveled light, swim trunks, face masks, fins, and K-bar combat knives. Other equipment that they had with them were tetral, which was explosives, demolition packs, mine detectors, markers to record observations, and devices for determining water depths. So they had to carry all that with them when they were swimming. So at 10:55 a.m., the order went out to synchronize watches. Then the process began, dropping the men at their designated positions. A total of 12 gunboats were assigned to cover the teams. So as the Frogmen began their swim to shore, the gunboats behind them bombarded the beaches with gunfire and rockets. And that was to keep the enemy from shooting at the men as they were swimming inshore. But despite those best efforts, the swimmers still came under intense fire. One man later reported, gunfire splashed all around us, mortars and heavy shells which doused us. The noise, even underwater, was deafening, and the metal falling around them was terrifying. The idea was to run a chart of the beach to determine its slope so that they would know whether the ships could come in, and they were also looking for obstacles and mines. Another man described the bullets that were falling all around them as they were swimming underwater as looking like falling leaves coming through the water. Several of the men crept up on the beach to get samples of the coarse sand. One of the frogmen said, "We took a little fire doing that, but we got our samples and swam back out." They needed those samples to determine if the beach could support vehicles. At 11:55 a.m., as boats raced along the beach line at 16 knots, the pickup started. The catchers snagged the tired swimmers with that rubber dog toy ring. One of the sailors recalled, "We hooked their arms and swung them aboard." The frogmen in this event suffered only one fatality. One of the team members was shot in the head, and he later died of his wounds. So it sounds like they recovered him. They probably had to slow down to recover him, but he was not able to survive his injuries. According to the after-action report, the frogmen of Iwo Jima were gallant under the mortar and small arms fire as they made their reconnaissance right up to the water's edge. All exhibited an eagerness to carry out their mission. So that was the report that was written up on them. George's team, UDT 13, was given a special assignment. There was a rock outcropping that was too big to explode. It couldn't explode it, but it was a navigation hazard for incoming battleships. So George's team was tasked with making their way to this outcropping and setting up a navigational light to warn ships to stay away from that hazard. They accomplished this mission under heavy enemy fire. But unfortunately, the next day, the Japanese went out and removed the light that they had set. So the work had to be completely redone. Luckily, the second time, the light held. One disappointment with the battle was, despite the best efforts of the frogmen, they had brought back inaccurate information about the sand. Perhaps they had arrived at low tide, or they done the sampling incorrectly. I don't know, but the samples they brought back seemed much more stable than the beach actually was. There was a deep layer of soft sand on the beaches that kept the vehicles from being able to move. Within a couple days of the battle, there were so many vehicles abandoned on the beach that they became a hazard. So they sent George and his team to go in and blow up the abandoned vehicles and remove them so more troops could get in. One of the most recognizable images from World War II was taken at Iwo Jima when the American flag was raised on the top of Mount Suribachi, that an extinct volcano next to Green Beach that I showed you a picture of. So here's the image I'm sure you all recognize. By the time Iwo Jima had been secured, George and the underwater demolition teams had already moved on to reconnoiter their next battle at Okinawa. Oh, this is them moving on. Okinawa was the largest UDT operation of World War II. It involved nearly 1,000 frogmen. 1,000 frogmen. And while the Battle of Iwo Jima had been in somewhat warm tropical waters, the waters surrounding Okinawa were significantly colder. Long immersion in these waters could cause hypothermia and severe cramps, especially as the swimmers had no real protection against the cold other than that coating of grease. Their operations included both actual reconnaissance and then demolition missions to prepare for battle. They also went on decoy missions that were conducted to confuse the enemy about where the landing would actually take place, which makes a lot of sense because you'd think, well, the enemy's going to know that a landing is going to take place because they're suddenly having frogmen come aboard or come ashore and do things. They could just sit back and go, well, that's the beach. But they also did these decoy missions so that they would think, oh, maybe they're going to attack over here, and then they never did. The Battle of Okinawa was nicknamed the Typhoon of Steel. It was one of the bloodiest in the Pacific War, claiming the lives of more than 12,000 Americans. That's 5,000 more than had died at Iwo Jima, and 3 times as many as died during the Battle of Normandy. The Japanese lost 100,000 troops. The commanding generals on both sides of the battle died, but the American general died in combat. The Japanese generals died by ritual suicide when they realized that they were going to lose the battle. In addition to the military losses, at least 100,000 civilians were either killed in combat or were ordered to commit suicide by the Japanese military. The fighting lasted for 2 months and 22 days. Nearly half of the Americans who were killed in Okinawa were US Navy personnel, despite the fact that the Army and the Marines, like you see here, led the ground offensive. One reason for the high Navy casualties were the attacks by Japanese suicide bombers known as kamikazes. 34 ships were sunk in the Battle of Okinawa, and 26 of those were sunk due to suicide attacks. And an additional 368 ships were damaged. So in addition to the 12,000 American men who were killed in action, another 36,000 were wounded. And it's likely that George was one of the wounded men because he did suffer permanent hearing loss due to his military service. It's not clear because Joy mentioned it was fungus in his ears. It could have been fungus or it could have been an injury in this battle. Either way, we know his hearing was damaged. So when Joy, when I asked her, well, were you worried that George was going to come home safely? And she was confident he would. She had trust that he would. It kind of seems like maybe she didn't really understand the dangers that he was facing. But maybe she did, because she was right after all. He did return home just as she had known he would. Here's a telegram that she kept her entire life. It's the telegram that he sent from a hospital in Port Smith, Virginia, after he returned to the States. And it's hard to tell, but if you look closely, you can see that this telegram was sent on August 15th, 1945. It was the same day the Emperor of Japan declared their surrender to the Allied forces. Now, the formal acceptance of Japan's surrender was made on September 2nd, 1945. Just 5 days later, after that, George was honorably discharged from the Navy. He was 24 years old, and for the rest of his life, he preferred not to talk about his war experiences. So when you listen to Joy tell her stories, you may have noticed how energetic and self-reliant that she was. Well, she was even more so when she was a teenager. It was just not in her nature to just sit idly by while her husband was overseas. The US military was in desperate need of naval ships for the war, and there were a great many being built in Wilmington, so there was a real need for workers. So I'm sure you've all heard of Rosie the Riveter, pictured on the left. Well, there was also Wanda the Welder, or sometimes referred to as Wendy the Welder, or my personal favorite, Joan of Arc, because they were arc welders. And it's not often that you hear a good welding pun, so I get a kick out of that one. So there was a huge need for tackers and welders and burners at the shipyard. And with the men off to fight the war, they were willing to let women work. So 18-year-old Joy jumped at the chance to go to work and to make a difference in the war. She trained as a tack welder, and she commuted back and forth to Wilmington by bus. I'm not sure if she did it every day or once a week, the commute. I don't know. I could never find that out, but she did go back and forth between here and Wilmington. Starting in early 1941, the Wilmington shipyard has been producing huge ships called Liberty ships. And they were used for carrying ammunition and tanks and troops and guns and other supplies overseas. And in total, the Wilmington shipyard produced 243 Liberty and Victory ships. So this picture of women welders was published in Life magazine in 1943. Now, I don't know if there's anybody on the call who's a welder, but if you are, you might notice right away something unusual about this picture. So on one hand, this is a positive picture because it highlighted that women were able to do the same jobs as men. But on the other hand, what concerns me about this is it appears that the photographer must have asked these women to weld without putting their protective masks on. Because if they put their protective masks on, which should cover their entire head, you wouldn't be able to tell that they were women. So they did this welding, you see these sparks flying without having that protective gear on. So it's very ironic that they were putting these women at greater risk than they would ever put men at, simply for a photo op. So here you see a picture of actual, women welders wearing the equipment that they are supposed to be wearing, the proper safety equipment. An article in the shipbuilders newsletter that was put out by the Wilmington Shipyard stated that they were extremely pleased with the job the women were doing. In fact, they said that they were especially pleased because the women had a lower absenteeism rate than the men. And what the newsletter didn't mention was that women were also cheaper to employ. So on average, skilled male workers made $54 a week, whereas skilled female workers averaged only $31. Okay, so I have another video. This one's about 5 minutes long, and Joy's going to be talking about her experience as a welder. And when it starts off, she's talking about actual welding, what she had to do as a welder. Kind of starts before I do that, here are some women welders, and there shows the actual safety equipment that they have. You can see the masks that they have up on their heads. Those would cover their entire faces. They're also wearing long sleeves. They're wearing long pants. They're wearing socks and heavy shoes. And the one woman is wearing gloves, which is what they would be wearing if they were welding. So you need all of that kind of safety equipment when you're welding. And that will become important when Joy tells her story. So let's try this.
To draw beds like that, a row, then I had to take another row and put like that over that, and then I had to do another row, and it was like 3 rows, and then they had a trough full of water. I would have to take those plates and go out there and clean them up. We had steel brushes. I'd do that. So you wasn't supposed to roll up the coast through your pants that I forgot. Oh, and when but when I had my helmet on and I was doing my beads, the steel was flipping all over. I didn't know it. All of a sudden, my legs got hot, and all of that stuff had got down in the cuffs of my dungarees. And I was on fire. Oh no! I pulled my whole pants off and went and jumped in that trough of water.
Oh my! Were you okay?
Yeah, I was okay.
Wow.
But I drew a crowd.
Yeah. I bet you did. Now, were they mostly women that were welders at that point, or was it mostly men?
No.
Mostly men?
They were ladies.
Oh, ladies. Yeah.
I didn't care if I wanted to do something, because my parents told me, you can do what you want to do, you can do it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That was unusual for that time, right? For girls to be told that.
Absolutely.
And you did. You just went ahead and did everything that you wanted to do.
But what happened being a welder?
Yes.
The welders, the certified welders, had to go in the bottom of the ships and cut round holes so that they could run all those wires.
Right.
Well, this guy named Smokey, he needed a tack welder. So I ended up as a tack welder, his tack welder. Every one, a man had his own tack welder. And what I was tacking was, I think it's called aluminum. It's like a tin, and if you touched it, you could blow a hole in it quick, and it would turn green. So I learned to be a tack welder. And after we got out, some of the people, Bubba Rogers, we was talking one day, and I said, well, I used to be a tack welder. He said, you're lying. I said, no, I'm not. I did a tack welder, and I was a tack welder for a guy named Smokey. He says, I'm going to prove that you don't know. He went and got a piece of tin, and because he welded, and he brought me a stick welder you held in the, holder, and he said, now let's see you draw something, a bead or something like that. And I took that over, it was white. You put it in that holder. I put my helmet on, and I showed him I could weld. I never become a certified welder.
I see. And so was he amazed? Was he amazed
that
you could weld? Yeah.
He said, I'll be damned. She really meant it. I said, you thought I was lying, didn't you?
So.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed getting to know Joy a little bit and hearing her stories. She actually, in this video, on camera, she said that she forgot she wasn't supposed to roll up her pants legs, but off camera, she told me that it was hot. It was Wilmington in the summer. It was hot, and she just didn't want to keep her pant legs down. She was trying to cool off, and so she rolled them up. She just figured that rule was silly, and she didn't agree. She didn't tend to follow rules that she didn't agree with. So that time she did learn her lesson. Okay, so this picture here, this is obviously not Joy, but it reminds me of Joy because you see this woman welder who is toasting her sandwich for lunch with her welding equipment. And considering that Joy had a long history of making up her own rules, I think she might have just toasted a cheese sandwich with her welding equipment if she had thought of it. Charlie, is there another question in chat? I can't see it.
Yep, hold on.
Okay.
It's from Tara Bella Southport. Thank you. Amazing.
Okay, great. They must have to go. I'm sorry, I'm running a few minutes late. There's not much left, but I understand it does seem like we're running a few minutes long because we had those videos. So the North Carolina Shipbuilding Company in Wilmington turned out to be the largest wartime industrial effort in the state. While other ship and war plants operated in the city and across the state, no other facility had as great an impact. But then the war came to an end, and the millions of soldiers who were fighting overseas started to return home, and they wanted their jobs back. And so the women in the workforce were thanked for their service and then encouraged to go back home to their homes where they belonged. So you can see in this poster, good work, sister. We never figured you could do a man-sized job. America's women have met the test. And you can see the V for victory. But pretty much that was a thanks and so long. Almost overnight, the image of America's women began to change. So on the left, you can see this was a wartime poster ad. They went from being portrayed as competent, strong women in the workforce, or soldiers without guns, as this one says, to what you see on the right, which was afterwards, they became helpless creatures who couldn't even open a ketchup bottle. They were told that their new patriotic duty was to return to the kitchen and to running their homes. And for a little while, that's what Joy did. George came home from the service and Joy left the Wilmington shipyard. George started working in his father-in-law's charter boat business and eventually purchased his own charter boat. After the military terminal was built at Sunny Point, George went to work there and stayed until he retired. And he and Joy started a family. They had 2 daughters named Joanne and Rosemarie. And this photo I like because it gives you an idea of what life was like in Southport in the early 1950s following the war. This is from the 4th of July parade in 1953. The boy riding the tractor is Tommy McGlamory, and he was pulling little Rosemarie, Joy's daughter, in a homemade float as part of the parade. Unfortunately, Tommy's legs gave out before the parade route did. And so in the end, the fire truck that was in front of them threw Tommy a rope and towed them both the rest of the way of the parade. So there's a little slice of small town Southport. Despite the pressure for women to become full-time homemakers after the war, it just never fit Joy's personality. And by then, Joy's mother was widowed and she was living with the family. So she cared for the children while Joy went to work. Joy held various positions, including working in social services as the deputy clerk of the Brunswick County Superior Court. She also had her own businesses, running a bar, a trailer park, and a dress shop. But the role that Joy was most proud of was becoming the first female sheriff's deputy and jailer in Brunswick County. And eventually she became the chief deputy. Once I asked her what she liked best about being a deputy, and she told me that it made her feel like she was something. Joy did a lot of volunteer work as well. She was a secretary for the North Carolina Baptist Assembly at Fort Caswell and a longtime volunteer at Dosher Memorial Hospital. George was always supportive of Joy's desire to work outside the home, and he encouraged her volunteer activities. He continued to be a prince of a husband, understanding Joy's need to keep busy. Joy told me, "He must have loved me. I worked all the time. He let me make the decisions and he never complained." George and Joy were married nearly 60 years before his death in 2002 at the age of 79. Joy continued her volunteer work at Dosher Hospital until just a few years ago. She worked at the gift shop and the front desk, greeting people, and still driving herself wherever she needed to go. Sadly, last month, Joy passed away at the age of 96. She was a remarkable woman who always lived up to her name, bringing joy to everyone who met her. She was a supporter of the Southport Historical Society all of her life, for which we are very grateful. She wrote several articles about her experiences that we have in our online research room. And her oral history interviews, including the excerpts you saw today, are on our YouTube channel. So I hope that Joy's oral history interviews also underscore the importance of oral history to capturing local history. We're always looking for people to conduct the interviews. They mean a lot to us and they mean a lot to the people who are being interviewed. It gives them a chance to share their memories and to recognize their contributions to the community. And I think you could tell in the interviews that Joy was enjoying herself. These days, we do a lot of our interviews through Zoom, so the recording is really easy, and we also, of course, have equipment if you do them in person. So if anyone is interested in helping, please send us an email. Okay, that is the end. I'm going to stop sharing. All right, does anybody have any questions or comments about that? Does anybody know, did anybody know Joy? No? Okay. She was a wonderful woman, and I was very privileged to get to meet her and do that interview. And if anybody thinks that looks kind of interesting, thank you, Candace. If anybody thinks it looks interesting and would like to do some oral history, we're happy to have your help. As you can tell, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. I certainly wasn't doing a perfect job in those interviews, but we're able to pull out pieces and be able to share them. And we really can get a lot of information out of those. So any other questions, comments? Okay. Oh, do you already have people you know you want to interview, just need interviewers? Yeah, pretty much. We have people that, and we kind of try to match people with people that they would want to talk to. We kind of say, there's this person, this is kind of what we know about them. We give you a little bit of information so you can help form the questions. And then people can say, yeah, I think that's somebody I'd like to talk to, or, you know, no, that's not for me. So it's all very flexible. And it does help with Zoom. Some of the people are not real Zoom savvy, but sometimes they have a family member who knows about Zoom, who can, you know, help them set it up, and then they just have to sit there and talk. So it doesn't have to be in person. Okay, so next month we will have Pat Kirkman will be in person. It will be at the library. We will also be, it's our first attempt at doing a hybrid, so we're going to be trying to Zoom it and have it in person. And Pat is going to be talking about the history of the frying pan lightship. So it should be very interesting. So I hope to see you guys all next month. Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.